To Washington now, where lawmakers have overcome their differences at the 11th hour to pass a spending bill to avert a government shutdown. The stopgap plan, approved by the House and Senate, will keep federal agencies funded until mid-November. The hard-fought compromise provides funding for domestic disaster relief, but no new money for Ukraine.
Two-thirds being in the affirmative.
It was a nail-biter until the bitter end.
The bill is passed, and without
But with the
objection,
shutdown looming, the House of Representatives voted to fund the government for another 45 days, with more Democrats than Republicans supporting the bill. The stunning turnaround means hundreds of thousands of federal workers and military service members will continue to receive a paycheck.
The American people have won. The extreme MAGA Republicans have lost.
They have brought us to the edge of a needless shutdown, trying to blackmail the country into accepting their extreme right-wing agenda. And today, Democrats came to the rescue. Speaker McCarthy admitted defeat and asked Democrats to put out the fire that he and his party had started.
In the end, Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy defied demands by his own party's hardliners for a partisan bill full of spending cuts and severe immigration restrictions that should pass the chamber with only Republican votes.
But I'm a type of conservative that wants to get things done. It's easy to be a conservative that wants to do nothing. But I believe America wants to find the conservative that can make government work efficiently, effectively, and accountable.
McCarthy's gamble paid off, but it puts him in the crosshairs of his party's far-right faction. Republicans like Matt Gaetz of Florida have threatened to try to oust the House Speaker.
If somebody wants to make a motion against me, bring it. There has to be an adult in the room. I am going to govern what is best for this country.
After that, it was on to the Senate, which scrapped its own stopgap bill that contained $6 billion for Ukraine in order to approve the House version and avoid a shutdown. After the vote, top Senate leaders issued a rare bipartisan statement reaffirming their support for Kyiv. The vote comes on the heels of a visit to Washington by President Volodymyr Zelensky last month, where he made the case for continued U.S. support.
Despite that, Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said the United States still stands behind Ukraine. He expects the Senate to vote on a new package of aid before the end of the year.
Most Senate Republicans remain committed to helping our friends on the front lines, to investing more heavily in American strength that reinforces our allies and deterring our top strategic adversary, China. I'm confident the Senate will pass further urgent assistance to Ukraine later this year.
For more, I'm joined now by DW's William Glucroft, always monitoring U.S. politics. William, so a shutdown's been avoided, but it means no more funding for Ukraine at the moment. Has Washington turned its back on Kyiv?
Well, you just said it, no more funding at the moment. There is still considerable bipartisan support for supporting Ukraine in terms of economic aid and security assistance. It just isn't involved in this particular continuing resolution that's going to go on, extend for 45 days to keep the, as you said at the top, the lights on in Washington. The hardline right-wing Republicans in the House are more skeptical of supporting Ukraine, and that's why it didn't make it into this bill. But congressional officials say they think there's enough funding for Ukraine already in the pot to get them through that 45 days, and Ukraine is not going to run out of money, at least from the American side, until there's an opportunity to bring up a separate spending bill that would continue that funding. And as we heard from Mitch McConnell just then, it is likely that some amount of funding will receive bipartisan support, enough to get that funding through whatever that next tranche of money is going to be for supporting Ukraine.
Make no mistake of it, funding is still on the table. President Joe Biden signed the spending bill into law just minutes before the midnight deadline. Talk about the 11th hour. Why was it so hard to reach this deal?
Well, this is a tactic, this kind of threatening a government shutdown is a tactic that the party in power, if they're not sharing the party with the party in the White House, often do. It's a very high stakes game, and it's been happening a lot in the United States recently. There's been 14 shutdowns since 1980, most of those in the Reagan years in the 80s. But we've been seeing threats of shutdowns being used increasingly more as a tactic. And as you have this very raucous, divided Republican Party, forget about working with the Democrats, but just the Republicans in the House don't agree. You have very far-right Republicans, these so-called MAGA Republicans, who are diehard supporters of Donald Trump. And then you have slightly more moderate Republicans being led by, like, the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, and they themselves are fighting amongst within the party about passing resolutions. And it was actually the Republicans, their own party, that was holding up things this time. The Democrats were ready to play ball. And then, as you said, in the 11th hour, this bill was passed actually without any of these MAGA Republicans and with the Democratic votes. And that's how this finally came together. A bit of bipartisanship, but certainly not a bipartisanship in a way that suggests a smooth functioning of government.
William, less than half a minute, but I do want to ask you, this bill only keeps the government running, again, until mid-November. What happens then?
We'll probably be here again. November 17th is when this funding runs out. We'll probably be looking at this again. Congressional officials say that they'll be negotiating on more funding packages until then, but Congress does not have a good track record of appropriately funding the government in the normal way. There's actually, according to the Government Accountability Office, just 3 times in 47 years has Congress been able to pass a budget through the official process, and they've always had to rely on these so-called continuing resolutions to just kick the can down the road and get the funding, just keep the lights on, as you say.
DW's Aya Ibrahim joins me now from Washington. What are the main sticking points that have led to this last-minute dash to the finish line?
I think the main motivator was what the consequences would have been, Hannah. I mean, we were looking at an impending government shutdown that would have seen essential services for Americans stopped, thousands and thousands of workers either not getting paid or getting furloughed until Congress could find an agreement on this new budget. And what it took is somewhat of a legislative miracle here on Capitol Hill, where a Republican House Speaker had to work with Democrats to get that temporary bill passed. We have to emphasize this is temporary. This is by no means over. And it took a compromise, and it seems that the compromise in this case was funding for Ukraine, new funding for Ukraine. We have to also emphasize. And so, it remains to be seen what happens with Ukraine. As you know, in these 45 days until a new budget has to be found.
Yeah, I want to ask you there about Ukraine. What should we make of the fact that this spending bill doesn't include any additional aid for Ukraine?
Important to flag is that funding for Ukraine till the end of the year is not affected, because that would still utilize previously approved funding. But what we're looking at is funding starting 2024. And I think this sends a really, really harrowing message to Ukrainian leadership. Just last week, we saw President Volodymyr Zelensky visit Washington, D.C. in an effort to lobby congressmen and women to get this funding approved. And what it says to Volodymyr Zelensky is that U.S. support is not to be taken for granted and by no means guaranteed. We have, however, heard from Republicans who support Ukraine and also Democrats that this is likely to be solved soon, that they are confident that a bill for Ukraine will be passed, but we won't know for sure until there is a new budget, and they have 45 days to figure that out. I think European leaders should also take note of what happened today in Washington. As we head into an election year, the issue of Ukraine is increasingly, constantly being used, especially by Republicans. And this sends a message to European allies that they have to also have a plan B in case, for example, we see Donald Trump return to the White House next year. What will Europe do in that sense if they can't rely on U.S. support anymore, or at least not rely on it to the extent that it has been till this point, if it doesn't stay on this level?